Hello students, welcome you all back to the subject of industrial engineering and management. This video will be discussing about unit 3. So unit 3, it is about wages, incentives and the ergonomics. And this part of the video will be discussing about the topics which have been highlighted in red. The wage incentive schemes, wages, objectives of the good wage system and the basis for a good wage system. First of all, what is wage? There are so many definitions and so many conceptual part about what wages is about, but wages in general, to put it on a very simpler terms, it is the return which is given to the workers for the mental as well as the physical efforts which they have put into the production process. Usually wages, it has started up, the history of wages, it is basically about giving something to the workers who do the work or put in their physical and mental effort. So later on, it has been upgraded and it has been revolutionized as a monetary compensation, more specifically a kind of remuneration or a personal expenses which is paid by the employee to an employee for the exchange of work which is done for the benefit of the employer. So the payment, how it is done in a wages, it is usually calculated as a fixed amount for each of the tasks completed. You usually take a wages as a number of pieces, depending upon the number of pieces completed or number of the work hours which the employee has put in, or it can be based on an easier measured quantity of work done, whichever is feasible or whichever is adaptable to the particular work environment. The organization puts up that as the wages. Objectives of a good wage system. Wages, it is a very useful tool for securing a better utilization of manpower, better productivity, scheduling and the performance control, and more importantly, it gives a more effective personal policy. It is a kind of win-win situation where the employer as well as an employee gets benefited for the work which has been done. An objective of a good wage system is to increase the workers' earning even without dragging the firm into a higher wage rate structure. Just because you are paying the worker to a higher rate doesn't mean that the firm or the organization should incur losses. It has to create a good balance system in a way that the worker gets benefited as far as the industry or the organization doesn't get a loss due to this higher wage system. And also it avoids an additional capital investment for the expansion of production capacity, because when the employee is paid well, or when the wage system is more optimal, it is more clear, the employee will have a very self-motivated to work to its fullest potential, which will in turn create the ideal platform for the organization to meet their required demands, rather than planning up to expand their production capacity, which incurs an additional capital investment. This will create a more feasible solution for the organization. So what are the factors that affect the wages? First one is the labor market conditions. It is purely dependent upon the demand and the supply as well. If the number of workers required is more than the availability of the workers, then the employees will be paid much as a higher rate of work. It applies predominantly to the sectors, construction sites and physical work which is involved. If obviously more people are willing to do the work, then obviously you will have you can see so many people who are being paid less. On the other hand, if there are already very few shortage of workers, then obviously you will have that will create a demand, and that demand will enforce the organizations or the firms to pay the employees on a higher wages. The second factor is the legal provisions. The government has made certain laws and acts for fixation of minimum criteria wages, as mentioned in the Act of 1948. So that will also contribute to significant extent to the fixing of your wage system. Next, the working hours and the cost of living. Usually, as per legal laws, for any physical works involved, the worker has to be completing 8 hours of work, and that depends upon the number of persons who are involved in it. So usually the law states that you have to work for 8 hours, and the cost of living also has to be taken into account. Wages should be fixed in a way that it satisfies the minimum needs of the worker. We usually have this concept of city allowances. People who can look up to their fathers, and you can look up to your relatives and brothers' pay slips. You see that there is a concept of city allowances, which is usually provided to the people who work in cities, metropolitan cities, so that it helps them to meet the required minimum needs of living in that particular city, because usually the cost of living in that particular area seems to be a little bit higher. So even that has to be considered. And the type of employment, it can be, if it is a regular employment, you have to be very specific about the pay structures And if it is a contractual employment, then you can you can opt for a more contractual basis, like you can give only consolidated pay rather than giving the different scale of pay, and you're fixing up their scale bandwidth. All those things doesn't come into play if you're going for a contractual employment. Again, that depends upon the requirement of the industry. If the industry is looking for a contractual employment which is for a very short period, then they can go for that particular option. And but on a employee perspective, you see that a regular and a permanent job usually provides a security of services, so that creates a sense of safety and security to the worker. The company's ability to pay. We usually get this concept like the MNCs are paying good, the MNCs are paying big. It is because their ability to pay. And if a company is running into losses, then they will not be in a position to pay more than the minimum wages. That has happened to many industries in COVID, where they were not able to meet the required production output, hence they were not paying their employees to a good extent. Whereas a profit-making company, they can give the workers a share in the profit as well. So a good example can be Zomato, which has created a platform where their shares can be brought in by their customers and their employees at much cheaper price rather than for the general public, for which the prices are a little bit higher. The nature of job is also another factor that will affect the fixing up your wage system, depending upon the worker skill and the condition of the work. Sometimes a worker and the skill comes into a play where predominantly you do only manual kind of work, you cannot automate that work. So that is a place where you have to pay the worker to a greater extent. The condition of work, if it is involving more of a physical work, then you need to pay them a little bit on a higher note. And if it is less of an probably less of a physical work is involved, then you can correspondingly, if it is an unskilled employees, then you can pay them a little bit less. Again, it's purely based upon the decision of the organization and the firm. What are the characteristics of a good wage system? The good wage system should guarantee a minimum wage to the employee, and it should be able to keep the worker motivated. More specifically, it has to self-motivate the worker to achieve the required output, and it should provide a scope for the employees to get reward for their additional effort. You call them to be in terms of incentives, right? This is a quite common term you see in most of the industries, where if you're going well beyond your actual required target, then you will be given an additional amount that is called as an incentive, that is depending upon the quantify of the work you do, or probably the revenue you have generated through that additional work. And a good wage system should be consistent. You should not be altering it frequently. Even you look up to the case of central government, we usually have this pay commission which is revised every 5 years, right? That is what most of your central government schemes are for 5 years, which means that for 5 years that will not be disturbed. And a wage system should be very simple rather than being more complicated, and shouldn't be more difficult for an employee or probably an unskilled worker to understand. So the concept of wages, it started off with providing minimum wages from based upon the Act Committee on Fair Wages Act, which is in the year 1948, which has defined the wages which govern the wage structure in the country, especially for those sectors who are termed as underpaid. So rather than the next category was developing into moving on to the next category of fair wages, where they were paid a little more of higher. And most of the Western countries had this option of providing a living wages, which is a good wage system, probably the most ideal wage system, where the employees will be paid on a very bigger scale. Right now, India are planning to move towards the third stage of living wage, where the employees will be paid at a much higher rate when compared to the current stage of fair wages. Even though we started off with minimum wages in the year 1948, now we have advanced ourselves to the next category of fair wages, and the next category will be again currently they are now planning to move on to a living wage system, where the workers will be paid on a much higher scale. So we'll have a quick glance about what a minimum wage system was initially. Minimum wage is providing for the life of the worker as well as for the preservation of the efficiency of the worker. So it considers the family as three consumptions: one for the earner, the earnings of the women, the children, and the adolescents are disregarded. And the minimum food requirements is calculated. We usually have these three requirements, right? The basic human needs: food, shelter, and clothing, right? So the first category of food, a wage system should be able to provide a proper food to the workers as well as his family. And the minimum food requirements was calculated based upon the net intake of 2.7 calories per adult. That is for per meal. And the clothing requirements are estimated at a capita of 18 yards per annum per person. So that was again the minimum requirement, which for depending upon which the wage has to be fixed. The next system is your fair wage system, which is slightly above the minimum wage system, but it is well below the living wage system, which was most commonly followed in the Western countries. The lower limit of the fair wage is obviously the minimum wages, and the upper limit is said to be the capacity of the industry to pay. So, which means that irrespective of the kind of industry, be it a manufacturing, be it a service industry, or you take into account an MNC, or you take into account a small or medium enterprises, it is fixed that the minimum wage should, the lower limit for fixing a wage system should be the minimum wages which is required or which has been defined earlier, and the upper limit is completely based upon it is like it's like depending upon the ability of the company to pay. Now, say for example, an MNC will be able to pay it on a much bigger scale, whereas small and medium enterprises will be able to pay it on a much smaller scale. So the upper limit is given, the autonomy is given to the industries or the firm to decide. The third category is the living wage, which I said is the current scenario where India is probably moving in the next few years. A living wage is one where it should be enable the earners to provide himself and his family not only the essential needs of food, clothing, and shelter, but it also have the opportunity to provide the comfort to his family members. The comfort includes a good education for his children, the health insurance policies. Of course, the health insurance policies have been incorporated in many of the pay systems and pay scales operate in the many industries. Even service industries have this concept like where you have been given an option of providing that they are providing you the concept of group insurance where you can claim the insurance for your family members whenever you feel that they are fighting against need health, right? So also the requirements of social needs like any other misfortunes including old ages are also included. So it is quietly above. We could see that the level has been gradually increasing. If we started off with the minimum wages where it is purely focused only on providing food, clothing, and shelter. Then it came to fair wage system, where in addition to the food, cloth, and shelter, you had a certain minimum requirement, like this is the quantity of food which is ideal for a good to maintain a good health for the employees. So that is how you just elevated the system. And current system of living wages, it's little more beyond, where you are not only giving the basic system, they are also providing the additional requirements of comfort, including the children, education for the children, protection against ill health. It includes your insurance and as well as, right? The next is your Indian wage system. We'll have a quick glance about how the Indian wage system is about. Indian government is planning to move from minimum wage system to a living wage system by 2025. Of course, we are at the end of 2024. It needs to be probably in another 3 to 4 years. We see that we'll have few of the steps which are taken by the Indian government to move towards that. In an Indian wage system, you could see that the difference between a minimum wage and a living wage is that the minimum wage system, it may differ by state or country, whereas the living wage system, it varies depending upon the city and the location in which you are surviving. Also, the focus is more towards the basic survival needs, whereas in a living wage system, the focus is predominantly on the essentials as well as the discretionary of spending. It includes your, as I said, the comfort to your family members, right? And the goal is to set a baseline for wages, whereas in living wage system, the ultimate goal is to reduce poverty and improve the worker well-being. So that will create a bigger impact to the overall economy of the country, right? Rather than providing the basic requirements of wages, when you are planning to reduce the poverty and improve the well-being, obviously the workers will be paid big and they will have the opportunity to elevate their lifestyles to a greater extent. And next is our time wage system. In this method, worker is paid depending upon the time he has spent, maybe an hour, a day, a week, or a month, depending upon it. So if you're it is calculated purely based upon it. The quantifying factor is only based upon the time. The greater advantage of following a time-based system is that it is very clear, it is very simple, and it provides a guaranteed minimum wage irrespective of your output. If you're working for 8 hours, say for example, you'll be paid 100 per hour, then if you're working for 8 hours, you'll be paid 800. That is going to be fixed, no matter what your output is about, right? So it is more suitable for industries where the output is very difficult to measure. When you find it very difficult to measure the output, then you usually see that. More precisely, you can look up to the service sectors, right? It includes your IT sectors. You see that the minimum norms which is fixed that you have to be logged into your system for minimum of 9 hours is what usually the IT sectors say that, right? So it is the time limit which they are fixing it up because the output is highly difficult to measure. They follow this time-based system. The next one is, and obviously you see that whenever there are few advantages, you see some disadvantages as well. Informed earlier, or as we have discussed earlier, the the merit being the minimum wages which is fixed to the employees, the demerit is quite opposite because the industries need to pay the employees irrespective of their output. Even if they are not performing well, you see that on a particular day or probably in a particular month, you see that their output is not that to the required level, then you need to pay them a little bit. You should be planning to pay them a little bit lesser, but since the wage system is purely about time based, you will be paying them to the maximum level or the required level on par with the others, right? So it cannot be considered as a progressive wage system. So it also creates a sense of negligence towards the work because the worker will feel that even if I am not performing or even if I am not giving the required output, I will be able to get the required pay. So that creates a sense of negligence towards the worker. So the second category is your piece rate system. So what piece rate system does is that it is quantification factor is only about the number of outputs. So it is more suitable to a manufacturing sector where you can measure it using the number of pieces which has been produced. It is directly related to the skill of the worker and the capacity, speed, and precision in which he is doing the work. And the merits as well as the worker skill is taken into account. Hence, you need not have any supervision or inspection because the worker will not have any negligence. He'll be very sure that if he's working more and if he's producing more, then he'll be able to pay. He'll be paid more. On the other hand, if he is not producing the required quantity, he'll be paid less. So it is more of an easier way for the industries not to have any supervisions or inspection over there. And the demerit said that obviously the quality is not maintained because worker will be more specific about producing number of quantification, right? It is not more about the quality. He'll be more focused about number of products he's producing. So the worker may intentionally ignore some safety rules because he will be more focused towards increasing the quantity numbers rather than more focusing on the quality of the work he's producing. So you need to have that kind of supervision in that aspect, for which you have to be ready with the other remedies to so as to ensure that the quality of the work is not affecting. I'll put up in a simpler term. So how you calculate wages is number of days work multiplied by the rate per day. It is for the time rate system. If you're calculating for hours, then it is number of hours work multiplied with the rate per day. On the other hand, for a piece rate system, you calculate number of units produced multiplied by the rate per unit. So if the N is going to be higher, obviously the wages will be higher. If N is going to be lesser, the number of the wages the employee will be getting will obviously be less. Thank you. The next video will be continuing with the other part of your unit 3.